This video contains disturbing content, violent content, jump scares, and sudden loud noises. Viewer discretion advised.
Creepypastas are stories detailing incidences of personal or worldwide significance that cover a range of topics from the scientifically founded to the paranormal or mystical.
Due to the accuracy and detailing of several of these documents, the validity of each case is left up to the reader to decide if they are based in fact or fiction.
Many feature scientific expeditions or the discovery of a secret experiment that plays a major part in the events that occur, often placing lives in grave danger or resulting in the creation or discovery of an entity now free to roam the face of the world.
In this list, we recount to you the events documented in the top 20 Experiment Creepypastas.
Binary DNA. The notion of pictures capturing a person's essence has been a widespread superstition in many cultures, and in the age of the internet, such a concept could be applied to video and audio files as well. It is this line of thinking that formed a secret society named the Cardinals, whose aim was to attempt to find a single strand connecting multiple files that may suggest a binary DNA link between them. According to what was recovered from journals and blogs to their dedicated followers, the Cardinals managed to track down exceptional cases of life trapped within digital files. These included the infamous Smile.jpg, Barbie, SuicideMouse.avi, and the elusive Grifter video. Alongside them, they discovered 3 more distorted files, Cradle.avi, Needles.mp3, and BurningMan.jpg, that all resulted in permanent shutting down of computers, nausea, disorientation, and the opening of an image file that could not be closed no matter the operating program. Further investigation into the raw data of each led to the discovery of 7 separate yet similar executable files which they named after the Cardinals' members: lust, gluttony, greed, envy, sloth, wrath, and pride. Individually, the files did nothing, but once linked together, they formed an entirely new strain that titled itself barelybreathing.exe. The society backed up the file on the hard drive and began studying it as much as possible before attempting to access it directly, leading to nothing. Their final notice board messages reflected their curiosity and eagerness as they prepared to open the file. The authorities discovered their remains within the hidden workspace, all mutilated beyond recognition, burnt severely, and slashed repeatedly to the point that not a patch of skin was left untouched. Their desktops had been destroyed, and the only data recovered from them was a command to run their new program. Although police confiscated the hard drive containing it, barelybreathing.exe continues to pop up deep inside the web, causing carnage wherever it goes. From the binary DNA strands of haunted files, a new form of life appears to have been born, although for now, its ultimate purpose remains unknown.
Blood freezing experiment. Documents recovered from the defunct MI5 building in London detail an attempted experiment to mutate a human's bloodstream, causing blood to solidify and encase a sustained wound, much like a defense mechanism, as well as other side effects that would supposedly enhance strength and durability. Blood plasma levels were increased, removal of blood volume was undertaken, and the subject's medulla oblongata was modified to allow for the altered blood state. Finally, a nomofungin, communizin, and paraformidine chemical combination was added that caused the mutation, whilst also holding together the internal structure of the modified blood and organs. However, it was agreed that such enhancements to humans would not only be dangerous, but incredibly costly, and therefore should only be reserved for invaluable ancients and world leaders. To that end, experimental trials were held on 3 male subjects, each who joined voluntarily and were given £35,000 compensation should unforeseen circumstances arise. Each subject, 22, 23, and 29 years of age, were to be monitored under a 6-day period with various tests of their abilities to be carried out at scheduled intervals. By the first hour, all subjects were screaming in agony as the initial effects of the mutation took effect. This subsided about 3 hours in, which was when subjects 1 and 3 requested a King James Bible. They were only granted access to this at hour 25 as per experimental instructions. Their request was noted as being due to their belief that their deaths were near. 3 days into the trials, the subjects were relieved to be taken out of the test rooms. Each was sedated and tested for durability against an incision on the right arm and a gunshot from a .45 automatic pistol. Subject 1's skin was almost immediately sealed shut by a dark, amorphous substance that filled the wound, causing the scalpel to become stuck within the residue. A clean shot with the .45 was encased in his skin within 3 seconds of impact. The results were similar for all the patients, who were then returned to their quarters. Unusual behavior from the subjects was recorded at hour 80. Each subject remained seated on their beds, moaning and unable to make eye contact. At the 110th hour, subject 1 passed out. A scientist retrieved a blood sample and discovered that his blood and the blood of the others had an unusually high acidity reading at about 5. The levels decreased slightly by 127 hours and remained constant at a pH reading at 4.4. Unusual silence and signs of aggression were noted leading up to the final tests at hour 144.
Physical observation of each subject noted a distinct change in their appearance. Their skin was tinted gray and had become somewhat thicker, and their eyes were bloodshot with pure black irises. This caused concern amongst scientists that further modifications would need to be made before another trial run. During the final gunfire test, the 3 students leapt from their marks and bit through the firing team, ripping one man's arm clean off and devouring it. The soldiers lost consciousness as they were bitten, suggesting a form of toxin in the subject's saliva. An evacuation of the general staff was called, and by the time a scrub team had arrived, all subjects had been reported missing. Further research into and development of this chemical defense were summarily discontinued. The location of the subjects is currently unknown.
Nazi Twin Experiment. By 1941, the Third Reich knew that the end of the Second World War was ending, a victory for the Allied forces. To turn the tables and assure their superiority on the battlefield, German scientists grew desperate and began a dangerous experiment. Using captured Jewish masses, they selected a pair of twins from the camps, a boy and a girl. They were taken to Birkenau, where they were promised freedom in exchange for aiding the German forces. Inside the facility, they saw test tubes containing fetuses of Jewish twins, signified by the brand of the Star of David on their tiny backs. The twins had a genetic test which determined they were a close match to each other, a fact that the scientists were extremely pleased with. After several days of isolation to break down their willpower, the Germans took the pair and strapped them down to a large metal table in the middle of an observation room. They were put to sleep, and when they awoke, to their horror, they discovered the surgeons had sewn them together down to the arm. Muscle fiber and nerve endings had been fused, allowing them to both use their conjoined limbs, but the shock caused them both to pass out. When the male subject awoke, he saw that an IV bag was draining a strange blue chemical into his vein. He then noticed that both he and his sister had grown larger, almost falling off the table. He decided to feign sleep and let the growth enhancer do its work when the sound of gunfire broke the silence. The twins were fetched and thrown into the battlefield, ordered to fight the soldiers attacking the base. Without question, they leapt at their attackers and ripped the Allied forces into shreds in a matter of hours. Hundreds, thousands of people massacred. Each time the German lines were breached, the twins were sent out, and each time they came back, their thirst for war grew tired and spiteful. After only a few weeks, they had another fight to win. But the sight of their family and culture locked away behind barbed wire was too much. They instead decided to fight against the Germans and free their people. But just as the war was almost won, the twins were struck down by another just like them, the Star of David branded on its back. And when they felt up their spines, their fingers met with the burned seal of German ownership. As the war's end drew near, more of these twins were sent out to the front lines. Some turned against the Germans, while others stayed the course and fought alongside the original for a German victory. Though the experiment was a success, history will show that this desperate move never paid off. Patient number 00179883. A patient was admitted to the psychiatric ward back in November 2005 against his will. The relatives who checked him in reported he had been suffering from insomnia and had been discovered attempting to self-harm. According to the patient, he had been awake for longer than they'd believe. The man was taken in under the number 00179883 and immediately treated for his insomnia and many fresh wounds found around his body, wounds that the new patient began picking at during his first evaluation, reopening them. During the interview, the evaluator Dr. Emile Lafayette diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia after 983 made mention of a female who was apparently quite hostile. He opted to not explain further, as he admitted it was unlikely anyone would believe him until she hurt someone. His dosages were summarily adjusted. He was taken to room 409 where another patient was already taking residence. Only 15 minutes later, patient 00178802 requested to be transferred to another room, as did 983. Both requests were denied. Several hours after that, 983 attempted to claim Dr. Lafayette ordered him to move to the isolation ward, and patient 802 backed him up on said claim. That was again denied. At midnight, orderlies responded to loud noises coming from room 409 to find patient 893 struggling and ordered the lights to be turned on before she comes. This time, patient 802 does not respond to any activity in the room. 20 minutes later, another commotion was heard, and the staff discovered 983 on the floor, restraints twisted and broken, and patient 802 dead. His face was slashed mercilessly, and his eyes gouged out of their sockets. Only at this point was 983 transferred to isolation room 626, while an autopsy was carried out on his deceased roommate. The coroner discovered the slashes had dug deep into the face, even hitting bone, and the cause of death was extreme exsanguination. A later procedure was conducted on patient 983 to determine if he had eaten the eyes of his former roommate. This theory was disproven, however. His vital signs were of a troubling nature, and his restraints were upgraded to full body to prevent further injury. The following day, another psychiatric evaluation was conducted with Dr. George Tulling, suggesting a possible dissociate identity in the form of a woman, using her to distance himself from the horrible murder of the night before. Around-the-clock observation was advised, much to the dismay of patient 983, who continued to warn the staff against taking such actions. After further attempts to turn off the observation room's red light, the head of Patient Care Division, Charles McKinney, stepped in and reinforced the policies of the hospital and its unwavering duty of care. This was echoed by Dr. Lafayette, who noticed that the red sleep lights had been turned off momentarily despite warnings. In the dead of the night, the orderly working the observation shift wrote an unfinished even report complaining about the unceasing screaming coming from patient 983. It tails off just as he considers injecting his ward to stop this agony for good. Dr. Lafayette detected an unauthorized entrance in the isolation ward and attempted to investigate this breach of conduct. She relieved the staff member and took over the observation herself. Over 9 hours elapsed before another report on the incident was filed. Dr. George Tulling conducted an interview with the new patient 00178986, a former staff member who was found setting the observation room ablaze, along with the equipment and data with it. Lafayette was removed before he could perish and was put under immediate supervision and treatment. Addendum: a secondary report was filed contradicting the original report. Dr. Tulling recommended to Charles McKinney the immediate isolation of Lafayette until an unspecified female has made an appearance before cremating them in the body of patient 983. They hope that any investigation will conclude that both patients perished in the fire, and that no one in the know will require a stay in the psychiatric ward themselves.
The Farnsworth Experiments. In 2013, 29-year-old Robert Lawrence Bowen wrote a manifesto about his discovery of the Farnsworth Experiments and the horror of what they produced. His father, John, a former worker on the experiments with his wife Emily, had explained that the Farnsworth Experiments were an attempt to make time travel a reality. Since no discoveries have been made, the government decided to keep the details of the experiment a secret out of sheer embarrassment. Any speculation over deaths or horrible accidents were entirely false, or greatly exaggerated. However, several months later, at Thanksgiving with his father and sister Kate, a strange man named Bill Benson arrived at the house, much to John's chagrin. They conversed privately, with only a few phrases about going back and denying the truth being audible. Knowing of their curiosity, John sat Robert and Kate down and explained that the experiments had been successful, but a major problem resulted in the project being scrapped, and the scientist team vowing to never discuss the details again. Bill pleaded with John one last time, bringing up the possibility of finding Emily, but John insisted that he leave. Weeks later, Robert attempted to research Bill Benson and discovered he was the professor at Bridgewater State University, along with two pictures. One of the Farnsworth team, including John, Emily, Ben, and two others, and the other of an older Bill with an expression of absolute terror. The dates of the photos had been removed, and so, with no real leads, Robert spent 4 years studying photography at college, forgetting everything. That is, until Kate broke the news that their father had disappeared without a trace. After a month of police investigations, Robert searched for Bill himself early the following year. He managed to trace the professor to an old Albany apartment building where he'd questioned his former neighbors who had last seen Bill 5 years ago. They gave Robert a package that Bill had dropped off before leaving, instructing them to pass it on to whoever came looking for him and appeared trustworthy. Inside, Robert found the same New Year's Day '85 photo taken at the Farnsworth labs. There were also reams of paper with complicated readouts and an old cell phone. He rang the only number on the phone and finally managed to reach Bill, who had instructed him to meet him at the Washington Park fountain. Bill apologized for dragging Robert into this and takes the photo, fleeing into the darkness. Following him, Robert tracked Bill far beyond the range of the park, yet instead of entering the city, found himself deep within the dark woods. There, he found a building made of material with one window filled with light and a single door at its base. Whilst taking pictures of the structure and trying to find another way in, Robert suddenly woke up on the ground with blood on his head, apparently having been knocked out. When he arrived back at the entrance, the door opened and Bill brought him inside. He explained that the Farnsworth experiments took place here, in the basement, and that their sudden transportation here was a result of the experiments themselves. While Bill made coffee, Robert headed downstairs to the labs to see them for himself. The first lab was small and contained standard equipment, but through the second door, he found a larger room, old and decrepit, with the same New Year's banner from the photo hanging from the ceiling. On one of the tables, though, Robert discovered a notebook detailing the experiments from one of the scientists' perspectives. Early entries were normal, but became more spaced out as time went on. The final line read, "We're being watched. I know it. I hate that hole." Robert decided to document everything, but his memory card of the camera was full, despite him only taking a few pictures. Scrolling through them, he discovered the time he had lost. He had found Bill outside whilst checking the perimeter, and the two of them had already entered the laboratory. In this very room, they had found a door that currently didn't exist, and, upon opening it, Bill had seen something that had given him the same terrified expression Robert had seen in the picture he'd seen almost 4 years ago. The final picture was of Bill's corpse splayed out on the floor in front of a gaping void. Robert's sickness was quickly overtaken by fear as the sound of whatever force posing as Bill descended the stairs to find him. The the creature revealed itself to be a mass of gray tendrils that spread across the room and grabbed Robert, pulling him closer to the dark hole through the third door. Robert awoke in a field seemingly spared, but for 3 years, he'd lived his life under the constant surveillance of them, the monsters that his parents had allowed to reach Earth through their efforts to make time travel possible. Trapped as a prisoner in the year 2013, Robert detailed his story so that maybe, after the Farnsworth Experiment ended, and after his own disappearance in 2110, his friends and loved ones will know the truth behind his disappearance, and would not attempt to change the past or risk suffering a worse fate.
World's Best School Psychologist. A rather unusual social experiment was carried out on March 23, 1993, on a young boy in junior high. In his recount, he detailed how his parents were exceedingly strict and harsh, never showing much love and care for their son. He eventually decided to pay a visit to the school psychologist, Dr. Tanner. After unloading his emotional baggage on the good doctor, he recommended that the boy return to his office at 4 p.m. on the day in question, and he promised that after a month, his situation at home will have completely changed. For after all, he claimed, he was the world's best school psychologist. The well-mannered and kind doctor seemed harmless enough, even likable. So the young man did what he was instructed and told nobody of the rendezvous. They shared a soda together, and soon after, the young student fell asleep, waking up handcuffed to a bedpost with a television and NES set up nearby. Dr. Tanner appeared through the doorway and informed the boy that he would be staying here for about a month. While he was at the house, the boy could play video games as much as he pleased, but when the doctor needed to leave for school, he could instead watch TV, as the handcuffs would have to be put back on. Every day, the boy would play games and be fed while Tanner was there. During school hours, he would tune into the news. Reports flooded in of a desperate search to find the missing student who had seemingly vanished without a trace, with his parents at the forefront of the search. He watched as for the first time in his life, they showed emotion towards him and finally valued him as their son. This drew to a head when at the end of the month, the charred, decapitated skeleton of a young teenager turned up in a plastic bag beneath the overpass. With his parents now at the brink of what they could take, Dr. Tanner gave the boy another glass of soda. He made him promise to not tell anyone of this, and that everything should be better now. The boy awoke in a park near his house and returned to his relieved parents, who treated him much better from that day onwards. But it seems that the doctor's brag of being the world's best school psychologist was correct after all. But just where did he find a headless child's corpse?
The Romanian Knowledge Experiment. During the 1960s, renowned scientist Alexandru Sift studied the Hoia Baciu fruit, repudiated as a paranormal activity hotspot. Although he took detailed notes of his experiments to unlock the secrets of the region, most were found burned and destroyed at his residence after his death in 1993. What few documents survived always ended in the same phrase: knowledge is harmful, ignorance is bliss. This piqued the interest of the Romanian government, who decided to hold their own experiments in the forest a decade later. Their first and only test involved 3 male volunteers to venture eastward across the terrain and document their discoveries every half hour as they made their way to a single cabin. Of course, none of the men were told the true nature of this experiment to ensure their cooperation, and were promised a large sum in compensation at its conclusion. Thinking they simply had to traverse Through the wilderness using a compass and a single light source, the men were airdropped by helicopter into the western zone of the forest at midnight. The first subject left carrying a backpack of food, water, and oil for his lantern to last till morning, as well as paper to record his journey. He arrived at the cabin 2 hours later, alarmed but physically unharmed. His notes mentioned sensing a presence in the woods, but the closer he came to the cabin, the more real his shadow became, always on his trail. Subject 2 was dropped at the same point with the same gear, except his lantern had been replaced with an infrared camera. However, he arrived at the cabin a good 5 hours later, clearly suffering from psychological and mental trauma. He spent the next few months in a psychological care before recovering. His notes were further spaced apart and detailed his frightening journey as he fled and hid from what he describes as a glowing red shape through the camera. He opted to take as few notes as possible to reduce the chances of the creature sneaking up on him, a decision that most likely saved his life. The final subject was again given the same gear, except he had a night vision camera. Despite waiting until dawn, the man did not arrive at the cabin. As the agents left, they discovered his crumpled notes outside on the doorstep, but no trace of the man who wrote them. The only entry was dated only 5 minutes after embarking from the landing zone, where the hitchhiker encountered the beast, and he described it as being taller than a bear and hunched like a gorilla, supporting its weight on all its extremities. Its eyes were said to be pitch black, and it began pursuing him, knocking aside trees as it ran, which is where the notes end. The experiments were discontinued in that area, and the Romanian government secured the entire forest behind an electrified fence and watchtowers under 24-hour guard. No one is allowed in, and nothing can get out.
The Harbinger Experiment. In 1971, a renowned scientist referred to simply as Dr. Zimmerman entered the eye of the scientific elite for all the wrong reasons. The man was a firm believer in the occult and sought to prove the paranormal and impossible, an undignified enough handle on science and reason, but it was his ruthless and inhuman means to prove his theories that earned him ridicule. However, that did not stop him from pursuing his latest theory in the form of the Harbinger Experiment. Zimmerman spent the next 16 years acquiring funds through less than reputable means, building a team of loyal followers, enlisting the aid of the other desperate members of the scientific community, and constructing a hidden base of operations deep within the Alaskan wilderness. The fortress appeared to be a perfectly inconspicuous structure amongst the staff cabin quarters set up on the surface. But directly beneath the entrance hatch lay a network of tunnels spreading out from the control room where all electronic and monitoring equipment was housed. One door led to the infirmary, another to the break room, and the third to a series of claustrophobic tunnels that disorientated anyone who ventured in or tried to leave. At the end of this maze were 3 observation rooms that would be occupied by the test subjects Zimmerman had acquired. All were native to Alaska, a young, unemployed male, a female drug addict, and an elderly drifter. All had 2 things in common. 1, they were all eager to participate for the reward, and 2, they had no friends or relatives who would miss them. They had been fed a cover story to lure them in. The experiment was posed as harmless and about how isolation affects the mind, which was far from the truth. The real purpose of Harbinger was to open a rift to another world and draw in 3 entities from their home realm. Isolated to the cells, they would inhabit the body of the 3 subjects and be contained within the cells for study. The actual science behind much of the experiment, Zimmerman kept to himself. But the concept alone brought many of the paid team members to feel regret at agreeing to take part, driving a very clear wedge between them and Zimmerman's loyal followers. By the beginning of the experiment in 1987, it was clear that no one would be able to back out or risk their own lives. At 9 p.m. on October 27th, Zimmerman summoned all of his staff in the control room to witness his triumph over science's limited vision. He began chanting into the PA system, a strange language nobody could understand. After several minutes, the ground began to rumble, and the cameras to the cells cut to static. The subjects' loud shrieks of terror carried through the narrow passages all the way to the scientists, and over an hour later, everything ceased. Although the cameras still did not reveal anything, Zimmerman was clearly pleased with the results and ordered the staff to bed. No one slept until they were called back to the entrance at 10 a.m. the following day. The camera to cell 2 was working, but revealed the deceased corpse of the female subject, an expression of overwhelming fear seared on her face. Zimmerman ordered the monitor be turned off and the picture to the other 2 cells re-established. Almost 2 hours later, Cell 3's camera was repaired, but the occupant was no longer human. What was Subject 3 had been mutated into a tall, gangly creature. Its head had expanded, and the eyes were deep, wide voids that stared into the souls of those watching it through the monitor. Everyone, even Zimmerman, were shocked and horrified with the results. He ordered a team to Cell 1 to ascertain the conditions of its occupants. The 4-man team rushed into the maze, clearly still shaken by the images they had received. But when they had arrived at Cell 1 and opened the door, the feed cut off in the hallway and the sounds of gunfire and screams echoed back. The rest of the team waited in stunned silence for whatever would return. Luckily, it was 3 of the team, dragging along with them the shredded remains of the 4th. They had successfully terminated the creature from Cell 1, but not before it killed one of their party and gouged the eye out of another. It had taken a lot of firepower to put it down, but no one dared return to check as the hallway camera was still out of commission. As the hours passed, Subject 3 continued to stare into the control room, and tensions rose among the staff, and even within Zimmerman's loyal ranks. It was clear that this was not within the result he had been hoping for, and faith in the experiment was at an all-time low. Slowly, a strange noise rose through the air. Emitting from the walls of the fortress, it was later identified as the song "Living in the Sunlight," as sung by Tiny Tim. It kept repeating over and over until it reached a volume so high that the scientist had to yell over it to communicate. When the ground rumbled again suddenly at 8 p.m., the music ceased. However, all relief was short-lived as the monitor to Cell 3 showed that it was now empty. Down the hallway, the music began to grow, even faster than before until it reached the door. Silence. The door bust open, and the noise was deafening. The creature entered the room of incapacitated humans and approached Zimmerman, lifting him up and tearing him in 2, dousing the room in his blood. It had moved from one person to the next, ending their life in one fluid motion with its long, razor-sharp claws. The only person to survive was a medical doctor who used the slaughter of his colleagues as a distraction to escape. He sealed the hatch shut and left when the only noise he could hear from below was the faint murmur of music. Many years later, he documented the events online so that people would know of the mistakes he and the others had made, as well as the curse of the pursuit of knowledge can bring upon this world. But he made sure to tell it now, before the song that had re-entered his life finally engulfed him.
XoRax. The horrible contagion known only as XoRax ravaged the world over, causing billions to perish. In an attempt to create a cure, a series of teams were sent up to find as many survivors as possible and find the source of their immunity. Only very young children were found alive, leading to the discovery that the disease cannot infect prepubescents. Transported to a forest to the south, the day crew quarantined and ran as many tests on the children while the night crew monitored their progress. In order to expand the time frame they had to work in, the scientists suppressed the children's growth hormones, effectively shutting down their puberty cycle, and sterilized them. Over time, the children learned of other areas nearby that housed other hopeful sites to fight and survive XoRax deep in the mountains. A group of exposed pregnant women were being treated with the curative supplements produced from the day crew's attempts. In other pockets, small settlements of uninfected were being established in woodland and desert areas. But along the coast, reports came in of infected who began to mutate and grow strange appendages. Their only hope for survival was to submerge themselves and keep hydrated, but it was unlikely the changes could be reversed. However, talk sometimes drifted to the virus and its origins, of which most claim began in the west across the sea. It was said that the infection there had done worse to its people than here, but nothing could be confirmed. The experiment continued for months, and the children began reporting hallucinations, dancing lights in the sky and in the air around them, which they were forbidden to talk about. Several of the day crew began getting sick, their skin growing hard yet hollow. This prompted a daily decontamination regimen by a third group the children referred to as the Scrubs. The bad news continued to arrive as the settlement in the mountains reported mutations in the newborn baby, their eyes wide apart and being over a natural-born weight. One of the further off settlements had somehow become infected too, but the treatment there had resulted in a mere extension of the lifespan by a matter of estimated years, rather than any long-term solution that had been hoped for. Eventually, as hope faded, the day crew began disappearing into the trees as the forest strain spread and the children were left alone with their new winged friends. One child awoke sometime later to the sound of fluttering overhead. He had been summoned, it said, by the great Deku tree.
Ganzfield attempt and experiment. Parapsychology is a constantly evolving field, gradually discovering more efficient ways to recognize extrasensory abilities. One technique that has been developed to identify ESP is known as the Ganzfield Experiment, which is easy to try at home. All you need is a ping pong ball cut in half, a darkened room with a single red light, a place to sit or lay, a white noise generator, and noise isolating headphones. This begins the process of sensory deprivation. Your partner's role in the experiment is to speak from outside the area of deprivation and try to contact you within your mind. If you should choose to undertake this experiment, everything that happens should be recorded. However, there can be issues with replicating the Ganzfield effect. Some people have undergone unexplainable experiences of paranormal and in some cases, nightmarish episodes. One group of college students who decided to try the experiment found that some things are better left hidden in other realms beyond our reach. Initially, the curious students attempted the procedure in hopes that Travis, the one undergoing the test, would start to see rather perverse images during his hallucinations and describe them to everyone in the room. Although as the night progressed, it became clear that he was not going to interpret any form of pornographic image within his mind, and many people who were watching filtered out, leaving only Travis, his friend Paul, and the anonymous individual who recounted these events. Around the 20-minute mark, Travis began to speak in a series of murmurs. His friends, somewhat taken aback, began to ask random questions, not expecting any answers. However, Travis managed to answer all their queries, often correctly, but sometimes not. Despite being unable to hear, he was also writing in the air with his finger as he spoke. The tables soon turned, however, as Travis began to ask questions himself, Things that had no apparent answer, like why are they here, who are they, and can they be stopped? His friends asked him who he was talking about, and were only met with the chilling reply of them. The experiment was terminated soon after, and Travis remembered very little of what he had seen during his sensory deprivation. The individual who recounted the tale said that sadly, him and Travis have become estranged over the years, and that his friend was never the same since the event occurred. Nobody is quite sure, however, just how different it made him. So if you intend to try the Ganzfield experiment on your own terms, be aware that what you find may not be as innocent as it seems. Happy Puppet Syndrome. Deep in the Alaskan forest, a hidden laboratory was discovered and an investigation launched. Abandoned, the facility had experienced much damage due to fire and the surrounding environment. Traces of blood were discovered in the ruin, as well as blockades sealing off what appeared to be an observation room. Much of the equipment and records had been burned beyond repair, but a single note had been left behind as a vague account of what happened here. A group of ambitious psychologists, having studied the human brain for many years, dared to tamper with the human genetic makeup to remove all sadness from the mind, to permanently keep someone locked in a euphoric state. They theorized such constant positivity would encourage greater learning and understanding without negative mental health holding them back. To that end, they employed the services of genetic scientists to grow children and alter them at the genetic level, a process that was left off the record so as not to be repeated, and so began the Angel Man project. But it would be a while before any positive results would be made. Half the babies died during artificial gestation, and the rest were too disfigured to survive birth. Only 3 remained, seemingly perfect and able to function like a real human being. 18 months into the trials, the first issues began to arise. Balance issues, insomnia, slow reaction times, and poor ingestion caused the team great concern. But the experiment continued. As they grew, the children developed tics and sporadic movements, as well as an incessant laughter that would not cease, no matter how much negative stimuli was used. The higher learning capabilities that were predicted from the alterations also did not occur. Ironically, the constant euphoric state made it impossible for them to comprehend or focus on what the scientists attempted to teach them. Their odd movements and warped smiles earned them the title of Happy Puppet Syndrome, since the children appeared to be mindlessly happy marionettes bouncing on their strings. By the time the experiment reached its 5th year, it was obvious that the trials were a failure, and so the children's food was laced with poison to terminate them painlessly. However, the scientist assigned to deliver their final supper froze upon entering the cell. He fell to his knees and clutched his scalp, screaming in absolute pain. The children stared, silently smiling for the first time, absolutely still, until the man collapsed. He spasmed briefly before falling limp. The isolation room was sealed off just before one of the children could escape, but as he fell into a fit of laughter, power throughout the facility was cut off, and the air was filled with the sounds of glass shattering, screams, whispers, and laughter. By the time the emergency power kicked in, only 2 scientists remained. They inspected the corpses of their colleagues, only to discover each of them laughing audibly beneath their breath. Both survivors described the feeling of being watched from the shadows by something just beyond sight, and to make matters worse, all the children had escaped. The remaining scientists burned the lab and fled to civilization. According to the notes, it appears that the symptoms spread with them, as cases of children falling into uncontrollable fits of laughter began popping up across the world. A cover story was created, but it would only be a matter of time before cases of the new Angel Man syndrome would grow to an extreme level. Why the only remaining member of the experiment, as far as we know, returned to the facility has yet to be determined. However, we do know that he's still running from the mistakes of his past, but it seems the past will soon catch up.
red moon. July 18th, 2020 saw the NASA vessel Goliath 1 begin its maiden voyage to the moon. Its mission? To survey the Serenitatum de Mare and begin preparations for mass colonization. A level field within a basin, referred to as the Sea of Serenity, Serenitatum was the perfect experimental foundation for humanity's first outer space society to build upon. Due to interference from within the basin and the secretive nature of the operation, the Goliath crew were ordered to only make radio contact when NASA's side of the Earth was facing them, when the signal would be at its strongest. Over the first few months, operations ran smoothly, as per journal and video entries sent back to Mission Control. The 6 astronauts detailed their initial setup to make the area habitable enough to be as hands-on with designing their new moon city, moving on to drawing up blueprints for a habitation zone. However, on the 17th of September, NASA failed to receive the daily update from the expedition team. An overhaul of the array indicated that both satellites were intact. However, the team themselves were failing to call or answer hails from Mission Control. Several weeks later, a second team that was sent to ascertain the fate of the original crew discovered a bloodbath, despite a clear lack of remains. With no explanation, they turned to the crew's unsent video logs for answers, with the dates lasting only one day after the initial loss of communication. The first video, dated for the 16th of September, the day before the base's silence, featured only 10 minutes of the team examining the Mare's border. Towards the end of the video, one of the surveyors mentioned scratching noises coming from the Bessel crater nearby, although no such audio was picked up, nor was this mentioned in their report for that day. The recording for the 17th begins with the team making notes of the area nearby the Bessel crater in the Mare's southern sector. It is here, however, that the scratching noises are picked up by the instruments and appear to interfere with equipment, angering one of the party. He attempts to investigate when an unseen entity pulls him down into the mile-deep crater, and the film cuts as he screams for dear life. The final video, labeled Code 7700, Please Help, is assumed to have been recorded on the 18th of September. One of the astronauts is taking shelter inside an oxygen tent, where he explains that 2 of the other expedition party have been brutally slaughtered, and that he has been cut off from the radio transmitter to call for help. As to the whereabouts of the remaining 3 experiment team members, he is unaware. The man cries as he attempts to both reason a way out of this situation and say his final words when the same scratching noises are heard from outside, the volume reaching extreme levels. At this moment, the camera is knocked aside and the man is heard pleading for his life before blood splatters the walls. His wails grow as what was later identified as the snapping of bone being ripped from flesh takes place. Brown liquid mixes with red, and a death rattle replaces his fearful calls. Records indicate that the 18th marked the rare phenomenon of the red moon. Since the entity of circumstances have never been completely documented or resolved, this information has never made it to the public. The single snapshot taken of whatever unknown creature that was encountered, nor the suicides of half the recovery team sent prior to the incident have been hidden away. Any continuation of the experimental moon colonization has been postponed for humanity's foreseeable future.
Necrosis. In the 1980s, a team of scientists ventured to Africa to study and experiment on the Wansin spores spread by the beautiful, yet toxic, blom flowers. Amongst the tribal natives outside of Kajuju, the spores caused madness and dementia, causing them to turn incredibly hostile and murder, even devour, other people, regardless of affiliation. The wounded and subsequently infected would even resort to self-harm, and despite the seriousness of the injury, would continue their rampage regardless. The scientist managed to isolate and study one of the victims, noting the clear necrotic transformation of his body paling and drying his skin and patches of green sores covering its surface. He eventually took his own life, and, upon burial, those present observed the corpse violently twitching beyond normal amounts of necrotic nerve firing. Further testing discovered the spore's ability to reproduce and regenerate cells even after the host has passed away, even morphing a person's physical appearance to become muscular and strong, especially in injured areas of the body where the spore concentrations were highest. These were marked with a red pigmentation and appear to be highly sensitive points where the Wansin was at its strongest and most vulnerable. Patients with these patches show Wendigo psychosis, an insatiable desire to consume human flesh. One scientist, referred to as Angel, was attacked by their primary subject and terminated the hostile in self-defense. Clearly facing infection, she turned the gun on herself. The science team returned to the United States, but due to their interference and the spread of other contagious diseases such as Ebola, the now dubbed Wendigo complex assimilated and evolved into a deadly airborne pathogen, spreading across Africa, with the eventual cases popping up all over America. At first, the stories reported the violence as unusual random acts such as splayed bodies on morgue slabs trying to walk out of the door, or bizarre, gruesome murders where victims were eaten in public areas. Even with borders cut off from access, animal life spread the contagion, and soon, entire continents were facing a crisis with living dead roaming populated areas, hunting down every person they could find. Many of the world's greatest scientific minds, including the unnamed scribe of these events who was present at Ground Zero, were taken to an underground bunker by the President of the United States. For years, they searched for a cure or a method to easily retake the surface. But hope slowly faded and the facility became compromised. The President, soon devoid of all confidence in their success, simply gave himself to the creatures, and the lone scientist takes down these notes for someone, anyone, to find. For he knows all too well what will happen to him now that he has been bitten as well.
Gundschau Effect, a documentation of one of the earliest recorded experiments carried out by the Nazis after the invasion of Poland. The Gundschau Effect lasted 5 days, and records only survive in the form of translated audio diaries used as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Doctors Victor Ubelgrenz, Josef Vermin, and team leader Klaus Gundschau isolated 2 Polish men, one of their daughters, and a pregnant woman from one of the first villages to become occupied, to observe the reactions to orders from their seemingly generous captors. On the first day, each prisoner was fed roasted boar and fine wine from Germany, all of them reacting with surprise and joy. Day 2 also began cheerfully with buttermilk waffles and orange juice, bacon, eggs, and sausages. However, after midday, the 2 Polish men received knives and were ordered to kill each other. Refusal would result in their execution, and killing the other subjects would have resulted in an elongated torture process before death. They complied to the outrageous demand, and the father was murdered while his daughter listened over the intercom. Afterwards, roast stew was served for dinner containing, as Gundschau himself put it, an extra ingredient. Day 3 started with cheese croissants and dipping butter, while the mid-afternoon saw the pregnant woman entering labor. The remaining Polish man assisted by giving her an emergency C-section and was left alone in the room with her, the baby, and surgery equipment. He was then instructed to pull out the baby's heart and consume it. After a little persuasion, he pulled out one of the instruments and stabbed the newborn through the chest and extracted the still beating heart, eating it in front of the mother. He attempted to explain his actions as the corpse was removed from the room, but the damage had already been done. Still alive by daybreak, the mother was muttering to herself quietly while her face showed no emotion. Cheddarwurst was served to each prisoner, and the former mother was given her task. First, she was instructed to carve slut into her breasts. Afterwards, she was given cutlery and told to devour her own feces, all of which she performed with no discernible reaction. She continued this even after the male was instructed to and carried out, beating her to death with the frozen remains of her child. Once more, the man tried to explain his actions to the frightened girl in the other cell, attempting to detach himself from his behavior. During this trial, however, it is noted that Dr. Ubelgrenz was shot by Gundschau for the attempted murder of a guard and ending the experiment. On the 5th and final day, after taking no rest after the frightful events both subjects had been witness to, they ate French crepes before the final task. In exchange for his freedom, the male was instructed to rape the young girl in every orifice he could find. This time, he accepted with no remorse or distaste, quickly performing all instructions and leaving her very close to death. He was handed a hacksaw and told to cut her in half from the legs up. Her screams filled the room, and when silence fell, so did his sanity. The man brought the hacksaw down on his own head and severed it down the middle, an impossible feat by normal human abilities, as noted by Gundschau himself. The experiment was a success. Gundschau had proven that, given a well-controlled society and environment, the promise of survival and good treatment will cause regular civilians to commit the most heinous of acts. This practice may have been carried out in German-occupied territories had the doctor not been killed by one of his colleagues after the experiment's conclusion, but that hasn't stopped the theory from being put into practice elsewhere.
Tulpa. An unknown author recounted a series of shocking psychological events that occurred a year prior to the writing, resulting in experiences that became too real for his liking. He discovered an ad in the local paper advertising for test subjects in a social experiment that paid good money. All it involved was sitting in an empty room with sensors to read brain activity, all the while imagining a double of yourself called a Tulpa. He immediately applied, and the test began the next day. Over the first few sessions, the author found it difficult to constantly visualize his doppelganger, but as the second week rolled around, he'd become quite the expert. The testers subjugated him to more stimuli. Loud noises and distracting sounds aimed to break his concentration, but even this was mastered in a matter of days. He became so well versed in conjuring up his alternate that the pair even began having conversations with each other, as well as interacting through rock, paper, scissors and other activities. His double allowed him to access subconscious memory, Thoughts and ideas long since lost or unobtainable. Deep personality traits and abilities of perception were now open to explore through this double. It was something he secretly decided to use outside of testing hours on dates and family friend get-togethers. By the 4-month mark, the Tulpa was now constantly present within the author's life, a fact that seemed to please the researchers. In the meantime, the author was slowly cutting himself off from the rest of the outside world, no longer being able to relate to others due to his higher perception. When one of his friends confronted him about his absence, the doppelganger pushed the author into confrontation, resulting into a bloody fight and a broken nose as well as a destroyed friendship. This was when the author became concerned at the Tulpa's ability to influence his behavior and make him lash out at even his dearest friends. The doppelganger appeared encouraging of this change, smiling gleefully and appearing somewhat more menacing than previously imagined. The physical manifestation grew worse and worse over time. Skin flaky and decaying, sharp teeth and long talon-like nails. His language became foul, and the horrible sounds from the experiment followed him wherever he went. The author channeled as much concentration as he could into erasing the Tulpa from his mind, but whenever he relaxed, it would pop back into existence only to terrorize him again. He continued going back to the testing facility, although he only pretended to summon his double there. The researchers, however, were aware of his resistance, and so forced him to undergo more tests, keeping him prisoner. They force-fed drugs into his system, encouraging hallucinations and nightmarish visions. What was worse, the Tulpa now no longer resembled a mirrored image of himself, but a tall, hunched corpse-like beast that tortured and taunted him with threats against his family and to his person. It now appeared to be able to physically harm the author, causing cuts and bruises to appear and inflict pain. Even the scientists, who ignored him the whole time, appeared to interact with the Tulpa as the days and weeks continued. As it made another threat to disembowel his sister, the Tulpa touched his forehead, smiled, and said, "All thoughts are creative," before leaving the room. Not long after, the author was sedated, and when he awoke, his restraints were gone and the facility abandoned. He escaped and informed the authorities, who found no evidence, and the trail went cold. Since the events, the author has become a recluse, not leaving the house or sleeping very much. Panic attacks and nightmares plague his life, and only sometimes can he concentrate enough to make them go away. However, 3 days before publishing his story, the author attended the funeral of his sister, who was, apparently, a victim of a mass murderer who mugs then guts their victims. Despite the nice service, he couldn't shake the sound of a disjointed, unsettling melody of noises building in the distance.
The Chernobyl Experiment. On the 15th of July, 1997, the Soviet Union allowed a U.S. strike team to enter the highly irradiated Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Pripyat, Ukraine. There, they discovered a journal from a previous expedition that lost contact not long after entering the area, almost 6 years prior. The huge levels of radioactivity had resulted in only a partial translation, but most of the important details have been discovered. The original Russian team had been airlifted into Chernobyl with subpar equipment even for the time, but a reasonable window to complete their experiment, to research possible life forms around and within the vicinity of the power plant. Their pilot was apparently killed en route, and the helicopter crashed in the surrounding area, meaning that they could not call for an evac until they found another power source. Since civilization would mean a long trek through the wilderness in any direction, the team decided to head deeper into Chernobyl. Some ruins were covered in blood, and the atmosphere was heavy with fog. After another unsuccessful attempt to radio for help, that confirmed that they were cut off. The team set up camp for the night. Strange noises echoed in the distance, and the early effects of radiation poisoning began taking their toll. 3 days into the expedition, and food supplies were running unnaturally low. To make matters worse, one of the squad members claimed to see a small child staggering through the nearby courtyard, armless and with no eyes. The next day, almost all food and ammo had gone missing, along with one of their number. The squad set off in a search of tartar in several of the structures, only to find horrific half-child, half-spider mutations that became hostile upon contact. They attacked with incredible speed and ferociousness, cutting much of the team down. As they escaped, the survivors discovered the remains of Tartar, who hadn't made it much further than the rest. The journal writer and another soldier were ambushed soon after, and the writer locked himself inside a nearby room, but left the soldier outside with the creatures. Over the course of the next 24 hours, the writer grew weaker due to the heavy radiation levels, but did catch a glimpse at the pale, featureless monster that appeared to lead the horde, as well as several other flying creatures that must have been the cause of the helicopter crash. The final entry describes hearing gunshots from rifles unlike the AK-47s the team had brought with them. But even so, whoever it was left soon after. It was at this point that the last surviving member of the team decided that they did not want to succumb to the monsters, nor the radiation. The journal was recovered from the remains of a body outside a building near the crash site, having apparently leapt to their death from one of the upper balconies.
Hostage situation. Hostage situation follows the events experienced by Lieutenant Jeff McInnes and his SWAT team as they attempt to resolve a hostage crisis at a local hospital. They infiltrate through the basement and head upstairs, noting that doctors and mercenaries alike have been slaughtered, but not by gunfire. Large gashes and heavy impact trauma are noted amongst the trail of blood and organs they wade through to find any survivors. But the strangest thing of all is the distinct lack of patience, and it's only when they find the doctors too have taken arms against more than the enemy soldiers do they realize that there's another layer to the situation than meets the eye. Whatever it has been let loose. After a warning from one of the surviving doctors, the other team are beset by ravenous patients undergoing a hideous mutation. Their eyes caked with yellow pus and mouths dry and foaming from an unknown substance, they attack anything unlike them with significant speed and force. Cut off from the outside, the teams become divided in the ensuing chaos, and the rescue mission becomes a trial of survival. Infected groups mean a horrific death, but some individual hostiles attempt to inject a strange substance into their victims that cause the mutation to spread to others. As time passes, the infected take on an even hollower form, corpse-like with no blood running through their systems. As McInnes, his scattered team, and the lone doctor try to regroup through the horde of psychotic deformed patients, the truth behind the hospital's operation is slowly revealed. The mercenary group were employed to clean up the existence of the hospital and get a hold of any research and chemicals developed. However, when several scientists revolted knowing their fate, the ensuing violence triggered the release of the infected patients who swarmed the entire facility. However, the fail-safes did not engage, resulting in half the horde escaping and half the SWAT teams infiltrating before they activated. Either the remaining officers and doctors wait 100 days to ensure the infected have starved before the lockdown expires, or the building is imploded, leaving no trace. The doctor reveals that they were working on a serum to perfect neural immortality, preserving a person's brain even after death has occurred to save their essence. It is clear to all that the results are nowhere near what they had planned to achieve. Luckily, the escapees have been wiped out, and the survivor managed to make their way through a collapsed wall in the underground parking lot one of the SWAT teams used as an infiltration point, but not before a series of hard losses and betrayals shook their world.
gateway of the mind. In an undisclosed facility, a group of scientists attempted to discover the true extent of the brain's potential sometime during 1983. Their theory was that once all possible human senses were shut off, a person would be able to perceive the presence of God beyond the physical boundaries of creation. The only subject was an old man who volunteered based on the fact that he felt he had nothing left to live for. His senses were purged one by one. First sight, then auditory functions, taste, smell, and finally tactile perception. All that remained open to the man were the thoughts in his head and the empty void that was the world around him. Although he could not hear, he spoke aloud in near unintelligible sentences that somehow got clearer with each passing day. 4 days passed, and he claimed to hear voices whispering inside his mind, which the doctors immediately dismissed as psychosis. However, days later, he cried out that his deceased wife was communicating with him, and that he could talk back to her. Despite this, the scientists were not intrigued by the incident until the man began naming other deceased people with whom he was talking, relatives, spouses, friends that the man could not have known about before. It was at this stage of the experiment that many scientists left the project due to the disturbing turn it was taking. After another week of observation, the disembodied voices only increased in volume, resulting in the subject resorting to self-harm to drown them out. Due to the numbing of his senses, however, the man was liable to inflict life-threatening wounds, without the pain as an influential factor. After much begging, sedatives were administered to the patient over a 3-day period to induce sleep. After which, even this resort was nullified by the patient experiencing severe night terrors. Now invading his dreams, the one haven available to him, the man was slowly driven insane over the course of the next few days. He clawed at his dead eyes and claimed the voices were growing more hostile and deafening, referring to the oncoming apocalypse and the hell consuming the earth. After which the man chanted, "No heaven, no forgiveness," loudly for 5 straight hours. The scientists, not willing to stop the experiment, being so close to a breakthrough, ceased all attempts at aiding in restoring the subject's sanity. He began speaking in tongues and attempted to eat the flesh off his arms. Once restrained, he stopped screaming and simply lay on the table silently and stared at the ceiling, tears falling from his eyes. A fortnight passed with no perceived change until one of the scientists entered the chamber and was apparently fixed in the man's gaze, despite being blind. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and He has abandoned us," before losing all vital signs. No cause of death was ever discovered, and no attempts at recreating the experiment have ever been made.
MK Ultra. The CIA began experiments through their Scientific Intelligence Division to develop a way to control the minds of an individual to obey their every command. Trials began in the early 1950s with varying levels of success, beginning with the use of LSD, a well-known perception-distorting narcotic at the time. The targeted subjects were made of mental patients, addicts, and prostitutes. One person was injected with the drug for 174 days straight. When it was decided that the candidate pool was too wide to have any noticeable effect, they went ahead with Operation Midnight Climax. A series of brothels were established in the San Francisco area where the male customers were doused with the drug and studied in close quarters through one-way mirrors. When about to fraternize with the staff, they would be taken to a holding cell where they were interrogated and frightened into confessing information. While this worked for a short while, the combination of drugs and stressful situations resulted in several subjects suffering cardiac arrest or being permanently mentally traumatized from the events. LSD was, as a result, discontinued as a candidate for the mind control trials, which had seen many scientists walk away from the project due to ethical reasons. The CIA continued their search and eventually stumbled upon MK-Ultra, a combination of barbiturate, a central nervous system sedative, and amphetamine, a powerful central nervous system stimulant. The records surrounding the discovery and trial phase of MK-Ultra were deliberately destroyed by the CIA after public outrage at the discovery of the mind control test broke out. However, some evidence remained, and modern forensic technology had pieced together the missing pieces of the last days of this experiment. Sidney Greenwood was the first person to whom MK-Ultra had been administered to, and the only patient to have been expressly monitored. He was injected in both arms, one with the depressant, the other the stimulant, resulting in him drifting into a half-conscious state, with both chemicals working to keep his mind at ease while still being alert enough to coerce. He was unable to talk initially, but after several questions, MK-Ultra took effect. The notes of Dr. Cottrell detail how the patient would babble to the air around him, though the room was empty. But after some time, they were able to get truthful answers from Sidney about his life. As the days continued, the scientist also noted how Sidney believed he was owned by the CIA, a side effect welcomed by the overseers of this experiment. However, they discovered the subject on day 4, bleeding from the eyes and frothing at the mouth. He remained in this state for another day, where it was noted that several scientists left due to experiencing severe migraines. On the 6th day, Dr. Cottrell went to check on the patient, only to find him missing and both guards dead. He implores the reader to let the world know about MK-Ultra briefly before the document cuts out, now blotted with a blood stain. Further research found a list of the deceased, including a Dr. Cottrell, who was found dead at his typewriter. It was also discovered that although Sidney, with his foaming mouth and glowing red eyes, was eventually found attempting to flee the base and executed, other subjects were injected with the drug. The facility was abandoned, along with the experiments, but no trace of the patients' bodies have ever been found, even a century later. It is clear that the patients of MK-Ultra are still alive to this day and live among us now, waiting for their chance at revenge.
The Russian Sleep Experiment. After the conclusion of World War II, Russian scientists were ordered to begin experiments on expanding the limit of human capabilities in preparation for the looming Cold War and possible subsequent conflict with the West. To that end, they initiated several trials, including their own sleep experiment on several political prisoners Russia had captured over the last decade. 5 were chosen to take part in the trials and promised freedom, an agreement none of the overseers would honor. The 5 were sealed in a test chamber with a toilet and running water, cots for resting, a plethora of books, and enough dried food to last a month. The test was simple. An experimental gas would be pumped into the room, preventing sleep for a 30-day period in which the scientist would observe the reactions the prisoners had. The first week was mostly uneventful. The subject made good use of the resources given to them and discussed their lives with some of the others in the room. However, as the weekend ended, each became paranoid of their surroundings and began muttering into the microphones and one-way mirrors around the chamber, completely ignoring the others in the room and even threatening to turn them in for some reward of trust. After 9 days, one of the subjects began running from one end of the cell to the other, screaming at the top of his lungs until his vocal cords are torn through the continuous strain, now only able to gasp and choke on the air. None of the other prisoners reacted to the noise and activity, at least until the second captive began screaming. They tore pages out of the books and covered the windows by sticking them on them with their own feces. Scientists spent 2 whole days relying on the microphone system to analyze and study the experiment, but the lack of any noise at all concerned them. However, they could determine the oxygen consumption in the room was consistent with 5 full-grown humans undergoing strenuous exercise. On the 14th day, the scientists reluctantly decided to enter the chamber, but when promising that, upon their full cooperation, one of the test subjects would be immediately released, one calmly responded that they no longer wished to be freed. Confused, yet curious, the scientists entered regardless after expelling the gas. This action provoked a negative response from the subjects, only 4 of whom were still alive in a manner of speaking. They had torn the flesh in chunks over their bodies and had laid their abdominal organs on the floor around them. The body of the deceased subject had been torn asunder, limb from limb, and was being devoured by the others. None of the food rations since the first week had been touched, and the torso of the victim had been stuffed into a drain in the middle of the room, causing the running water to pool 4 inches off the floor. When soldiers attempted to remove the subjects from their confines, they killed one by ripping out his throat and mortally wounded another by opening a major artery whilst attacking his genital region. 3 others committed suicide after the events that day, and one of the scientists broke his ribs and arm whilst removing one of the more docile patients. He was injected with 10 times the recommended amount of morphine, and even then took 3 minutes to die after his heart stopped beating, all the while asking for more. 3 survived, 1 having the ripped vocal cords. One of the other 2 was taken to surgery, struggling every step of the way, very nearly breaking his restraints and escaping the grip of the 200-pound soldier. He was put under gas anesthesia, which slowed his heart rate to a crawl, making it too dangerous to commence the procedure. The subject with the torn vocal cords was silently objective to the treatment, but agreed to it when a non-anesthetic surgery was suggested. After all his organs were put in place, the doctor noticed he was trying to speak, and managed to discern the words, "keep cutting," from his dry wheezes. The first subject was taken off anesthesia, and he and the other remaining subject had the same procedure, with the doctors all the while remarking on how it was impossible for any of them to be alive. Afterwards, all 3 remaining prisoners requested they be returned to the chamber and for the gas to be turned back on. The only reason as to why was because they must remain awake. Despite failing their primary objective, the ex-KGB military advisor saw promise in the trials and the subject's resistance to pain, and so allowed for the continuation of the experiment. The general personally oversaw the operations from this point on, beginning with the monitoring of their EEG brainwaves. None of them struggled when they were told the gas would be returning soon, and so accurate readings could be acquired. The subject who had been anesthetized before surgery kept dropping into a deep sleep before waking up in short bursts until finally his heart gave out. The autopsy showed he had widespread skeletal breaks caused by the strain his muscles had on them, and his bloodstream contained 3 times as much oxygen as it should. The only subject who could speak, now also falling briefly into sleep, demanded the chamber be sealed and the gas turned back on. The general ordered the chamber closed, trapping 3 medical staff within. 1 drew a gun and shot the general through the glass between the eyes. As the 2 members inside the chamber fled, the gunman terminated the life of the mute subject before turning to the only living specimen remaining. He demanded the abomination reveal its identity, to which it replied, "We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free from the depths of your animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds at night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralyze when you slip into the nocturnal realm we cannot tread." The gunman fired his weapon at the patient's heart, and as the life left its eyes, the subject breathed out the words, "So, nearly free."